Good afternoon. Welcome to the Canadian Apprenticeship Forum's live web discussion on cross-cultural apprentice mentoring strategies for success. My name is Marie Bilodeau and I'll be your host for today. This webinar was made possible through funding from Citizenship and Immigration Canada. Thank you all for joining us. This is by far our biggest webinar to date. So a few technical details before I hand things over to our main presenter. Since we're so many today, we won't be opening up mics for people to ask questions. Instead, you can ask questions by typing them. You'll see on the right-hand side of your screen, there's a question box. You can just type them in there at any time in the presentation. We'll field the questions and we'll pass them to the speaker after she's done presenting. This webinar is scheduled to be an hour long, so if we run out of time for your questions, we will follow up with you after the webinar via email. So you will get your answers even if it's not right away, but we'll certainly try to answer all of your questions. If you drop out of the webinar, just follow the link from your confirmation email to come back into the webinar. We'll also be recording the webinar, so we'll make it available on YouTube and on our website after the presentation, should the recording go well. So without further ado, I'd now like to introduce you to today's presenter, Maureen Brown. It's all yours, Maureen.
Thank you, Marie, and hello, it's Maureen Brown. I'm happy to be here with you this afternoon. I know we're in for a very good discussion, and I'm very excited. A little bit about myself. I am the founder and the lead consultant at Diversity Trainers Plus Incorporated, DTP for short. DTP has, for the past 18 years, provided training, strategic planning, implementation supports, and other services to organizations that are seeking to leverage diversity as an asset. And that's what we're talking about today, about cross-cultural, cross-racial mentoring becoming an asset in the organization. We work with clients that include companies, governments, universities, not-for-profits doing this work. One of the supports we have created is a book, a workbook, a handbook on cross-cultural and cross-racial mentoring, strategies for mentors, proteges, and mentoring organizations. And certainly that forms some of the backdrop of some of what we'll be talking about. So we're going to talk about 4 topics that we believe are, and from our experience, are quite important to employers and others who are involved with mentoring. So we'll start off by talking about why race and culture, why this topic, why is it an issue in apprenticeship mentoring. We'll then talk about 4 benefits that flow from successful cross-racial and cross-cultural mentoring. We will look at 4 challenges that can happen in cross-racial and cross-cultural mentoring, and we'll end with 4 success strategies that we believe and experience has shown will strengthen the mentoring for better results. So to begin our conversation, let's take a quick look at mentoring in the trades in apprenticeship. So as most of us know, an apprentice is assigned to a journey person who is in effect that person's mentor for anywhere from 2 to 5 years depending on the trade. And this mentor or journey person or master craftsperson, their role is to teach the technical aspects of the trade. They model safety and workplace expectations, the behaviors that the workplace expects of the apprentice. The mentor can also seek opportunities for the mentee, providing them kind of the inside scoop, so to speak, that will help them when it's time for them to get a full-time job. They share tricks of the trade with the apprentice, the kind of thing that you really can't learn from books. The mentor will help the apprentice to solve problems, and they also, in the case of mentees who are from outside of Canada, can help them to connect their prior learning with what we call the quote Canadian way. And so having a mentor in this journey person, really everyone wins. So you think about the employer, for example, and CAF research has shown that the employer's return on investment goes up from every dollar spent. The employer over the long run receives $1.47 in return on that investment in apprenticeship. For the employer, having a good apprenticeship mentoring experience will mean the apprentice will remain with the organization. So that organization has qualified personnel that's been trained up in the way they want to have things done. It also means that the apprentice will share what we call discretionary effort. And discretionary effort in the research means it's when people go over and beyond the basics, over and beyond what I'm being paid for, because I feel truly valued in this environment. So the employer benefits, in those ways. For the apprentice, it means, of course, they receive their certification. They also are now on their way to a well-paid career. And having a good start in mentoring is a good way for them to launch that career. It makes them feel better about things, of course. For the journey person wins because mentoring now becomes a more productive use of his or her time. They see they're investing in someone and they can see the results. They also have great professional pride in seeing their apprentice flourish. And of course, for the industry, successful mentoring, and certainly in a cross-racial, cross-cultural sense, means higher levels of professionalism and respect. It means the industry is better able to meet consumers' needs. And overall, it helps that industry to grow and to thrive. So it's a win-win for everyone involved.
So if everyone wins, Maureen, why is the topic of race and culture an issue in apprenticeship?
Well, that's a really good question, and that will launch us into the first reason why this is important. And it has to do with what is happening in Canada's birth rate and Canada's aging population. And as we'll see from the graph, Canada's birth rate peaked in the mid-1960s and has been in decline ever since. You'll see from the blue line that the replacement rate has remained constant. And so this gap in population means that post-boomer generation, so the boomers are the people who were born sort of in the 50s, late 40s, early 50s, going up into the early, maybe 1960. If this is the generation that is aging, and by the way, this is the generation where the trades, many of the tradespeople are among that population that is aging as well. But it also now means that Canada is searching for new sources of talent overall, and certainly, for the trades. So the question then becomes, where is this talent going to come from? And you'll see from the graph we'll show you shortly that Canada is replenishing itself through immigration. And for many of you, that's not news, but when we look at the extent to which immigration is critical to being able to sustain ourselves, including the trades, we'll see why, race and culture will become so important. So we know we are relying on immigration to replenish our dwindling population. As of 2011, the net increase to Canada's labor force has come through immigration. So that's a really important point to note. In less than 20 years, we are going to see that the population will be officially going into decline without immigration. And so it means that for the trades to sustain themselves, we definitely need new sources of apprentices, and those new sources are going to include, for the great extent, new immigrants. So take a look at how critical immigration has become to sustaining our population and our labor force. So the section of this graph in red shows the replacement of the population by natural birth. And so this graph starts us off at 1976, and you'll see that 2/3 of the replenishing of the population came through natural birth. As we have progressed over the years, I mean, the actual population numbers have increased and fluctuated, but you'll see that where we are now, which is 2014, by 2031, which is about less than 20 years' time, you can see that 100% of the replenishing of the population is expected to be through immigration, without which we will go into population decline, and the labor force, as a result, will be impacted. So that is a really important reason why this is a critical issue. Now, added to that, though, is the sources of new immigrants. And what we're going to see in the next slide is that the countries from which these immigrants are coming is going to show very directly why race and culture is an important issue. So what we'll see is that 80% or more of new immigrants are coming from countries outside of Europe. So our traditional populations and our traditional tradespeople have been from the European countries. Now what we are seeing is that the population itself is being replenished from outside of Europe. So what we'll see is if you add up Asia and the Middle East, Central and South America, the Caribbean, and Africa, that comes up to the more than 80%. And so, you know, these are countries where, you know, there are very different racial and cultural compilations and experiences. And so that now is being brought into a workforce that already has currently included mainly people who are of European background. So Journeyperson and Apprentice, definitely we're going to see that, you know, that diversity between them. Another important reason in this conversation is the growth in racial diversity of the country, not only through immigration but also through births within Canada. The new talent pool includes not only people coming from outside of the country but also immigrants from these 80% and the earlier immigrants, as well as their Canadian-born children. And so we're going to see further in the conversation that when we talk about attitudes to the trades, these are not only shaped by people who are coming in from the outside, it's also their children are being influenced in terms of whether they are open to or, you know, resistant to the trades. Bear in mind as well, this graph actually just shows a snapshot between two censuses, 01 and 06. And you can see from the green bar that the overwhelming growth in the Canadian population came from the populations that are visible minorities, aka racialized individuals. In the meantime, the trades, of course, are mostly occupied by people, you know, who are from countries who came here post-war, so maybe Italians, Germans, other East European immigrants, and their children, you know, who may have followed their parents' footsteps. So what we're seeing then is that increasingly the journey persons and the apprentices are going to be coming to that apprenticing relationships with very different mindsets and very different viewpoints. It also means that employers will need to be really thinking about different strategies that they may now need to use for hiring and engaging apprentice talent, or even the way they run their apprenticeship program, because they're not going to be able to use the same methods as before with these very diverse populations that we are expecting to, you know, replenish the old stock.
That's great. So how is the new talent pool different, and what does this different exactly mean?
Well, some of the differences that employers can expect, and I'll mention about 4 of them. One of them, of course, is language. And, you know, I'm going to mention them from the viewpoint of what the employer needs to be thinking about. So I'll pose them kind of as questions. So, for example, what happens when an apprentice or a prospective apprentice is clearly capable but still struggling with English? So do employers today need to think more as to whether they have a share in the responsibility for boosting English as a second language skills? You know, because they want this talent and the talent is there, and people are trying to learn English as fast as possible, but do the employers now have an additional role that perhaps before they didn't have? Another example is religion. So, of course, the countries where we're seeing the immigrants from, and as we saw earlier, are countries where, you know, Christianity is not the predominant religion. So the question is, what happens when the apprentice, the mentee, is observant to a religion that requires him or her to wear headgear that conflicts with the headgear that the trade is requiring them? So, you know, for example, a chef, you know, how do I wear a chef's hat if I'm, you know, having to wear a turban because I'm Sikh? Or, how do I wear a hard hat? Or, if I'm wearing a hijab, how will that conflict with what I'm required to wear? And so, these are really important questions that are going to increasingly come up. And to the extent that an employer is able to project themselves as saying, we know this, and, here's how we're going to make that accommodation, people may not be as interested in pursuing those trades. Another good example is when a religion requires an individual to pray outside of normal break times, and the employer is not used to this. And, what now do they need to do to prepare? A third example is with educational backgrounds. So, for example, in new immigrants who are coming, some of them are people who are highly educated. They might be unable to find work in their field. And so they're now turning to the trades, but they find themselves having a journey person who is younger, probably even with less formal education than they have. And so the dynamics of that relationship are going to be different than the dynamics of, the expected, younger person as mentee, older person as mentor. Given the immigration patterns, that may very much be turned around in some cases. Race is another issue that is inevitably going to come up. We're a society that is still grappling with, racism and racial stereotypes and assumptions about people of color. So the question is, how does the employer prepare their journey person and their apprentices to navigate this relationship where racial differences may come into play? Finally, another example is culture. And whether cultural influences come from having been born outside of the country or from the influence that parents have who have migrated here, the journey person needs to understand very much his or her own cultural, perspectives. And the apprentice needs to understand that, how their cultural perspectives may be similar to or different from that of the journey person. Because whether it's spoken or unspoken, it does come into that relationship. Finally, in this new environment, we'll find differences, with, for example, the expectations that people have of the work, service, and business relationships. Different countries, different cultural situations, there are different expectations, differences in communication styles, differences in presentation styles. And these are really critical because a journey person may have an apprentice who is excellent and who is brilliant, but they're communicating in a way the journey person is not accustomed to. So how is that individual going to understand and be able to, to properly mentor that person if they don't have a grasp of this difference in communication style? That brings us to the fourth reason. Racial and cultural diversity are an important consideration in mentoring and the trades. And it's this. Number one, diversity will at one level or other impact the journey person and the apprentice relationship. And in a way, this fourth reason brings together the other three reasons. So we want to acknowledge that it is going to have an impact inevitably somewhere along the line. And secondly, to maximize their return on investment in apprenticeships, employers now will need new strategies to manage that investment. And it doesn't matter whether the investment is time or monies, and it doesn't matter, this is not only related to the business sector, whoever, engages in apprenticeship, you are investing something. And this is going to be impacted by the different dynamics that we are increasingly going to expect over the next 10 to 15 years.
That's really great, Maureen. Would you mind elaborating a little bit on that?
Sure, Marie. So let's look at a little bit more specifically then as to how some of these could translate down into the relationship. The first challenge that we see here could come in different attitudes to the trades. New immigrants come to Canada often with one thing in mind: to make a better life for themselves and their children. They see this path to life as being education, and in this read a university education. As a group, new immigrants have higher levels of education than the general population, and this is coming from StatsCan. Then they also expect that they're going to continue on that professional path once they get here. It makes sense. Furthermore, many new immigrants see a good education, and again, read a university education, as a kind of insurance from discrimination in job hunting. So the thinking is, if I'm educated or my kids are educated, they're going to be hired, and no one will discriminate against them. So imagine their surprise then when they and their children are unable to find good jobs, sometimes any jobs, despite their education. And when B, they're now being told by well-meaning agencies that the trades are a route to the good life that they seek. So here's where the difference in attitudes now will come in. The new immigrant says the trades are menial, or he may think the trades are menial, or he may regard the trades as a plan B. The messaging from agencies and institutions and employers, on the other hand, is that the trades are a respectable and fulfilling way to earn a good living. Here's another example. The new immigrant says, I'm an educated person. I've worked many years in my country doing this trade. Why should I not begin near the top? The messaging from agencies, institutions, and employers, on the other hand, and part of the cultural belief here is, in this country, everyone has to pay their dues, start at the bottom. Now, whether we live it out or not is another matter, but it's certainly, an idea that a newcomer to a professional area might hear. Here's another example. The newcomer says, I've been trying for years to get a job, but because of racism, I can't get one. The message from the journey person, on the other hand, particularly if this individual or their forebears came to Canada at an earlier time, and often we hear something like this. Well, my grandfather came here with $3 in his pocket, and look at where we are now as a family. It's through sheer hard work. So you can see that this apprentice and this journey person are basically headed for a clash in attitudes to the trades, a trade that the journey person loves dearly and one at which they have spent many years mastering. So this clash could really affect the relationship in not only obvious visible ways, but also in invisible ways as well. Another challenge might come in the difference in perspectives and ways of doing things. Newcomer apprentices, they're not a blank slate. They have life experiences that have shaped the way they process information, the way they approach tasks. The journey person, on the other hand, will no doubt point out, well, this is Canada. You have to do it our way. Now, from long practice, however, the apprentice, while trying to do things, quote, the Canadian way, could very well find themselves slipping back into the old ways of doing things. It's our human tendency to repeat what has worked well in the past. And so, again, we can see a situation where the apprentice and the journey person are headed for, and the clash doesn't necessarily mean there's going to be, a major argument or a fight. It just means that we have two very different perspectives that are at play in a situation where the apprentice, is really, the journey person has a lot of power over the apprentice. From my experience, and the truth is sometimes, and I said my experience because we have heard apprentices say this, where the way they did it back home, quote, end of quote, is actually a better, faster, more effective way. Also, bear in mind that many new immigrant apprentices are working at technical jobs that they actually mastered at a higher level, quote, back home. So, for example, back home he was an engineer, comes to Canada, can't find a job, he's apprenticing as an engineering technician or even as an electrician. And so, that person has some ways that they can see a problem to be solved. And they may want to offer to do it the way they used to do it before. The journey person, on the other hand, will likely wonder, well, who is the licensed expert here? it's me, right? And this is the expert who also has to sign off on that apprentice's certification that they've mastered the skill. So this kind of challenge definitely could persist in the relationship unless that journey person is trained in how to use connections from one approach, one learning approach, one training approach to another in the way they instruct that mentee. So it's not necessarily rejecting everything, but if the old way or the back home way simply is not going to work here, just helping that mentee to know how to transition it into a new way, that is a type of training that would really be of help to the journey person. Another thing that the journey person needs, I believe, is opportunity to work through their own personal assumption about, the value of ideas that come from countries outside of Canada. And that is, their own belief that, if it's Canadian, it's best by definition, and, the countries, you're coming from, what do you guys know about this stuff? And so that is a different kind of equipping of that journey person that would need to take place in order to enhance that relationship.
That's great. So how could culture affect the relationship between the apprentice and the journey person then?
Really good question, and the one that we really look at very closely. So I'm going to mention 4 ways that come to mind, and there are many, but I'll pick 4 of them. One way that culture can come into play is with what we call workplace etiquette. So for example, in the apprentice's cultural background, socializing on the job is seen as slacking off. When you come to work, you hit the desk, you just work, you keep your nose down, and you work hard, and hard work doesn't allow time for chit-chatting as it might be seen. The journey person's personal and workplace culture might say strategic socializing builds networks because it brings people into the sightline of those who can promote their career. And that's one of the things, in Canada, we very much know the water fountain conversations are not necessarily a waste of time. And they are being used sometimes strategically to, the boss might be at the water fountain, and there are all kinds of ways that the etiquette in that workplace can be different between the journey person and the environment in which they find themselves. Another example is, for example, teamwork. So in the apprentice's culture, self-promotion might be frowned upon. And, there are many cultural settings where, the individual you don't stand out, try to stand out as an individual. Everything, the focus is on the group. Now, if in the journey person's personal and workplace culture, not standing out means a person, you're not outstanding, then this could be detrimental to that apprentice's progress, because here, the expectation is that you do blow your own horn and you know how to do it. So there's a thin line between blowing your own horn and just being arrogant. And so knowing how to navigate that line will be useful and an important aspect of teamwork. The apprentice who doesn't get that and is not able to navigate that could find themselves, not being invited even to continue with their apprenticeship or even with a job afterwards, because they may be seen as mediocre. And we've actually had in Ontario a human rights complaint some years ago that focused on this very thing, where the person worked hard through breaks and everything, and they didn't get that promotion because it was felt that, they are not a team player, or, they didn't show an interest outside of, their jobs. In the meantime, what they were doing is working hard. So that's an example. A third way might be in the differences in the way people handle mistakes. So in the apprentice's culture, loss of face can mean social and career death. So when a person makes a mistake or they don't understand something, they would rather leave that situation than admit that I didn't understand it or I made a mistake. In the journey person's workplace culture, on the other hand, the idea might be this: you make a mistake, you fix it, and it's a learning experience. So the apprentice may not have that as part of their sort of cultural makeup, And they, may try to cover up on mistakes, or they may pretend they understand what they don't understand, and obviously that's not good for anyone around. The last example is in what we call cliques, and this is a big one we see in workplaces. And what that means is this. To the apprentice, having others on the job from back home is a welcome relief. Finally, she can take a break from having to speak English all day. You can catch up with what matters, what's happening back home and so on. And, it's just a downtime for them in some cases. In the Journeyperson's personal and workplace culture, on the other hand, spending time with co-workers is a sign of being part of, quote, the family. It's seen that, you're one of us, you're like us. It's also a good way to pass on those informal skills that can build your workplace creds. And, in these settings, sticking to your own, quote, end of quote, especially if the apprentice and his or her friends are speaking another language, it can be seen to mean you don't like us, or even you're talking about us. It's viewed with a lot of suspicion, and the apprentice can lose out on the valuable bonus input that they could have had in their career.
What about racial backgrounds, Maureen? Why is the difference in skin color such an issue at times?
Well, differences in racial backgrounds, that's a big topic, as we all know, and we can look at it from different angles. But let's look at 4 scenarios where racial differences between the journey person and the apprentice could affect their relationship. So take, for example, the experience or lack of experience with racism. So the script might go like this. The racialized person, or the visible minority apprentice, has learned from experience that people will sometimes have negative stereotypes about him and his capabilities based on his race. He has learned to scrutinize and interpret his environment and the behaviors around them through the lens of that experience. He's worried, for example, whether those experiences could be happening again in this workplace, or maybe he has had some of those experiences. So he asks his mentor, which in theory, the mentor should be someone who is able to understand enough about, what that apprentice is going through to be able to help them to make sense of it. But sometimes not only can the mentor be dismissive of this apprentice's claims, because he or she has not had the experience of racism unless they have lived in a situation where they were in the minority. If they have not, then they could lack that understanding and be somewhat dismissive. They may even go as far as, warning the person about having a chip on their shoulder and, as being not a good way to proceed in their career. So the apprentice never brings the topic back up again. But that does not mean that the inner turmoil and ambivalence has gone away. And as we can see from our research in mentoring, that person sometimes will actually leave that environment, sometimes without explaining why, because they know that they are not being understood, and it means that they're going to have to put up with more of what they have been experiencing. So differences in whether the mentor has experienced or is able to empathize with the experience of the mentee, that is really important. Another example is in what we would describe as racism and classism, or skin color and classism. Now, in this scenario, the journey person and the apprentice are actually from the same country, but from different social classes. And the shade of your skin color often goes with the class that they're from. So in countries where there's classism of this sort, the lighter the skin shade, and it doesn't matter what country it is, those tend to be the people who are at the upper classes, and the darker skin shades in the lower classes or castes of society. But here's the twist. The apprentice in this case is from the higher social class or caste. The journey person is from the lower caste or class. We don't leave our racial identity at the door. We bring them into our relationships. Sometimes we like to think that we do, but we don't. And certainly when we have been this programmed to think of people in particular ways according to skin color, it does continue in our interactions. So this is going to determine the extent to which the journey person remains fair and objective towards the apprentice, whether she will enthusiastically take this apprentice under her wings to share those valuable trade secrets, or whether she's going to, do the basics and get out of there. It's going to determine whether she goes over and beyond to advocate for her apprentice, so the apprentice gets a job after apprenticing. And this also will depend on the extent to which the journey person has had the opportunity then to understand the dynamics of racism and classism at play between them, and the extent to which this journey person has been given the skills to successfully manage those dynamics.
Those are really great examples. Do you have any more?
Well, one other kind takes the form of jokes and unconscious racial attitudes. And, in some apprenticeship situations, this may be more of a problem, less of a problem, but it shows up at different, levels along that continuum. So the racialized apprentice faces, sort of in their lives, different attitudes and behaviors in different workplaces that can hinder his or her ability to fully experience and embrace that workplace. And a lot of times jokes, gestures, and comments are part of what creates the problem. Sometimes these behaviors even violate human rights codes. But the unspoken, practice in that environment might be whatever you do, you don't tattle to management. And so the apprentice says nothing. And so they allow, because it's a joke, they can't combat that, because someone will say, oh, you're just being thin-skinned, you're just having a chip on your shoulder, you need to suck it up. And we have heard all these experiences in different workplaces. But even in workplaces where that kind of, obvious behavior doesn't happen, there are sometimes more subtle ways in which people phrase things that technically do not violate legislation, but from the apprentice's perspective, to them it is belittling. Okay, and so you may not be able to put your finger on why this is wrong, but the impact on that apprentice may be unintended or intended, but it's not technically violating a code. And this sort of swings into a third way these jokes happen, and it's through what we call unconscious attitudes. So for example, an apprentice masters a task and is brilliant at it, and the journey person or someone in the environment, is really surprised, and they say something like, wow, this is really amazing, that you have done so well at this, given that, you guys are from, and you fill in the gap as to what country it's in. And so that sort of thing might be an unconscious way, but it's not, definitely breaking a rule, so to speak. So the journey person who's mentoring across differences in race and culture does need to have this skill set to understand the presence and the way these things may work out in their environment.
That's really great, and a lot of people are asking now, so what can the employer do to build these competencies?
All right, well, there are many ways. I'm going to mention 3 of them or 4. First of all, it begins with the employer acknowledging the potential impacts of race and culture. The employer needs to have that opportunity to say, it's not good enough to simply say, oh, we love everybody, we are okay. But that employer needs to educate themselves on the dynamics of race and culture and be able to own it. That's the place to begin. They also need to understand and know the changing demographics and the implications of that. Because, when you have multiple generations of, people who are European immigrants or descendants of European immigrants, many of whom have never even had a personal relationship with people of different races and backgrounds. And frankly, not everyone welcomes, the idea of, the environment being diversified. For some people, it's a loss of privilege and opportunity. And, they may not necessarily welcome it with open arms. Other times they may respond, by saying, well, we know we have to bring them in, but they need to conform to our ways. And so, there is no impetus for them to, to change the culture of the organization. the second strategy then is to provide journeypersons and apprentices with, and certainly journeypersons with what we call diversity competency training. And the competency idea means it's not enough for you to be a master of your trade. It's important for you to understand the dynamics of cross-cultural and cross-racial interactions so you can pass on that trade more effectively. The third strategy is to foster an inclusive organization and team culture. So it's not just about that one journey person and that one apprentice. It's about what is happening around in the culture of the workplace as well. And an inclusive culture is one that puts practices in place to ensure that people both feel and experience a sense of belonging. And it's in this kind of culture that they will fulfill their potential. And finally, the success is enhanced to the extent, frankly, to which employers treat diversity as a business or as an organizational asset. And this means taking it as seriously as they do their hard assets, you know, from their investment to their maintenance. You know, they wouldn't invest in a piece of machinery and leave it to simply, you know, rot. They would maintain it. They would make sure they're bringing it up to date and so on. And so employers need to recognize that diversity and cultural competence is not about a government edict or a law. It's a tool for workplace success. And so from this viewpoint, putting in the right structures to encourage apprentices to more fully engage in the workplace is not a cost, it's an investment. Gathering the knowledge and expertise to draw up the best from these apprentices is part of doing business, not fulfilling mandate, and it doesn't matter what the business of your organization is. And finally, holding people accountable for inappropriate behaviors and taking those behaviors seriously, that will also be a way to create that environment where people will thrive.
So what do you think employers should do to build success in cross-racial or cross-culture mentoring?
So to sort of just pull all of that together then and to just bring it in a wrap, there are 4 points I will leave with our audience. Number 1, the employer needs to understand racial and cultural diversity as the new normal. It is the way of the future. It's not going to get any less. It's going to get more. Secondly, they need to understand the challenges that are inherent in cross-racial and cross-cultural mentoring. Third, they need to become aware of the benefits of the successful cross-racial and cross-cultural mentoring. And finally, they need to be willing to build the competency among their journey persons to successfully mentor individuals whose background is different than theirs. And my belief is that you know, these strategies and sort of what we've talked about will place an employer in good stead in the face of their changing apprentice pool. And so I think that's the time we have today with our audience. Thank you very much for tuning in. I know you've sent in questions to Marie, and so Marie, you know, we're happy to hear if there are any of those we can answer in the remaining time.
Definitely. We have a couple of questions here. Well, we have quite a few, and I'm going to pick from them, and again, we'll send some answers to those of you we won't get to. But this one was one that popped out during the discussion. So somebody was asking, when you're discussing race and culture, how would you suggest dealing with sexual orientation in situations where the apprentice comes from a country that has a very negative attitude to either sexual orientation or to the sex itself of the journey person? Let's say the journey person is a female and the apprentice is male. So would you have any tips or ideas on how to deal with that?
Right. This is a really good question and a really good example of why the employer has to do more than simply put journey person and apprentice together. And so within that, first of all, you know, training and education is going to be important. So, you know, conveying to both sides, you know human rights codes, and offering opportunity to look at it not just from the legal perspective, but using case studies and scenarios, that is going to be important. you don't want to do it in a way that singles out that individual, and that's why, you know, making it part of the training culture in an organization is important, and that way you can bring together the journey person, the apprentice, and everyone else in that same setting where you know, where you can talk about these topics. But definitely this is one of the cultural and religious differences that may come with, you know, apprentices being from other countries, and even locally here as well, but as we're talking about it in a cultural context, it's very relevant.
That's great. Now, we're getting a lot of questions that are kind of along the same idea. So if you have one team member who's reluctant to be inclusive or to be accepting, how do you deal with that when you have that one, you know, proverbial rotten apple in the bunch?
Well, I believe we mentioned earlier about accountability. And what people need to understand and employers need to understand is creating inclusion does not mean not holding people accountable for their behaviors. I do believe that the baseline should be some kind of group training and bringing the group onto a common page of understanding, you know, what's expected. Now, once that happens, and it's done, again, not just in a way that says thou shalt not according to the code, but it's done in a format that allows people to ask questions, get clarification. Once that happens, then it's a matter of holding people accountable for their behavior.
That's great. Thank you. So I received a request here, a question on terminology, if you will. So you mentioned racialized person,
Right.
and some people were asking if ethnic minority, they were saying that ethnic minority seemed like something that they would be more likely to use. Now, what are your thoughts on terms like that, in a way that we're looking at terms as a way that can put further divide on these groups of people if we don't have the right terms?
Sure. So the difference between an ethnic minority can be any person who ethnically is, you know, in the minority setting within a given culture. So, you know, we could say, you know, if you are of a Jewish background in a situation where most people are not, you're an ethnic minority. Or if you're of Swedish background in a place where there are mainly Germans, then you're an ethnic minority. It doesn't matter what your racial state is. The term racialized means you are racially, your skin color, the visible difference is what puts you in that minoritized status. And the term racialized is one that has been more frequently used of late. Canada was challenged at the UN a few years ago when some reports were made as to the status of race and racism in the country. And the term visible minority was challenged by some of the NGOs that brought the reports forward. And so the term racialized is now increasingly being used as an individual who's, because of their racial status, there are certain qualities that are being ascribed to them, or they're having certain experiences that have nothing to do with anything except the color of their skin. And so racialization is a more, you know, it's a term that is being used more frequently.
Perfect, thank you.
Sorry, just to add that from the federal government's perspective, by the way, visible minorities is the term that the federal government uses. So anything to do with StatsCan and federal documents, you know, it's certainly still an acceptable term. It's just, you know, terms evolve, and so racialization is one of the areas of evolution.
Perfect, thank you. I think this is an interesting question. Who does the advocating with the employers? If there's an issue in the workplace, who should approach the employers? Like, is there some kind of a setup there that you could recommend?
So what should the setup look like for you to advocate with the employers?
Yeah, if there are any issues.
On behalf of the apprentice?
Yeah, the apprentice, or even if the journey person has issues too.
So the question about, I'll talk about the apprentice. Recently when we were doing some presentations at the Canadian Apprenticeship Forum, and one of the questions that came up a lot from the newcomer apprentices was, you know, what if I am experiencing certain things in the workplace, but, you know, I don't feel confident enough to go forward and say something. And, the rooms tended to be divided on that. So, some people feel, well, you're an apprentice and, you're in the less powerful situation. So, just accept it, bide your time, accept your credentials, and then go. But other people felt, and my feeling is that, we have gone through a lot of pains to create a work environment in which everyone has the right to feel accepted and respected. And so, I believe that, the apprentice can either self-advocate. I mean, ideally, it is happening inside of that workplace, so the apprentice can self-advocate. Sometimes an employer may have, sort of like how you have multiple layers in filing complaints. So you have the informal layer of complaint filing. But by the time you go out, the best advocacy, I think, is advocating with your journey person. The best advocacy for the journey person is to speak to the employer. But again, it depends on the extent to which that employer has created an environment in which this can happen. So people will be more or less, willing to come forward.
That's great. Thank you. Now, this is a fun question. I've actually had more than one person ask me. Now, I don't know if you can quote what you can bring into this. It might just be opinion. Feel free to state that. But I think in your experience in diversity, how can rural areas make themselves more appealing to newcomers from overseas?
That's certainly a big one, and we all know that Canada is making a lot of effort to. So at the high level, we'll say we're making an effort to bring in 300 immigrants per year. When we break it down, however, to where those immigrants are going, we all know it's the VTM zone, so Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal. And so what is happening then is that smaller cities and smaller communities are, particularly for immigrants from the business class and from the investor class, they are themselves putting out welcome mats. So some of them have local immigration partnerships where they are setting up specific programs and trying to get their dibs in at source where the new immigrants are happening. I've been asked, even before they come to Canada, I've been asked in workshops, what would happen if a community were to have, some information about itself? I believe, having the assets. Why come to my community, X, Y, Z? Here are some of the great reasons why. Here's what we have to offer. So it's getting into those spaces where, the quote competition is starting to happen. Even before people move to Canada, that might be one way, getting connected to the government's portal and so on. Once you're in Canada, people are always looking for places where they can thrive. And so there's nothing wrong with a small community, putting their wares out when they have, find where immigrants congregate. So, there are, for example, seasons when they're celebrating, religious holidays or special cultural holidays and so on. And I see no reason they can't, get themselves there and, talk about, the wonders of being in our community. Get attached to what the municipality or your local, the province is doing and get your voices in there. The other side of this I just want to add is wanting to invite them, but also you need to be able to hold them. And of course, there's a whole lot of reasons why people may not stay. I'll just say one thing, that I have seen people remain in communities where things are less than perfect, but you know what? They feel so included, and the local government does so much to make them feel welcome, and that influences the way people act, that they will remain there and set up businesses or even travel to another town to do their business. So there definitely are strategies that can be used.
That's great. Thank you for that. This is going to be the last question we'll be taking. There are a few more in queue, so we will be following up with some answers. But a lot of people showed some extra concern, and you did touch on this already, Maureen, but could you talk a little bit more about religious differences? A lot of people are mentioning toxic situations between different religions or religions that might traditionally have a more of a toxic role toward each other. Would you mind speaking a little bit about some more tips and tricks on how to work with that in the workplace?
Absolutely. The big thing that will make a difference here, and this is where the employer taking on a proactive role is going to make a big difference. So for example, the employer needs to lay the groundwork by having policies governing expected behaviors and so on. So you make sure you have a complaint policy. When people feel frustrated that I guess I can't complain even though so-and-so is treating me in an inappropriate way, they need to know that they have the right to complain if they do. But other things an employer can do, for example, setting up quiet rooms or the quiet spaces where people from religions that they want to, if they need to go and pray and so on, can go to. Now, it also means, however, communicating along with that very much the message to the population at large that we are an inclusive environment. And because one of the things people will say is, oh, you're just trying to get time off work. So the policy, the religious policy needs to explain that people are not just trying to avoid work. They are, maybe they're getting their break times at a different time or they're working extra time. I think being willing to deal with this situation is a big part. When it comes to religion, employers, they can get spooked. One of the other things, personally, I think employers, I see them doing is they go from one extreme to the next. So that kind of sets the tone of what will lead to toxicity. So, for example, there's a big debate around, do we celebrate Christmas? And that's, that's a big one. We could do another webinar on that. But depending on how that employer handles that situation, if the Christians in that environment feel that they're just being shut down, then of course they're going to get annoyed. If the Muslims in that environment feel that they're being blamed for Christmas not being celebrated, it's not going to be a good thing. So this is definitely one of the areas that the employer has a very specific role that they need to play in order for it to work well.
Well, thank you so much, Maureen. That was a doozy of a question to end on, and this was a great presentation. Thank you very much. I think you would be getting a good round of applause right now if there was sound from anybody else but me. So I'd like to thank you all for coming to our webinar today on cross-cultural apprentice mentoring strategies for success. We hope that you all got something out of it that you needed. We will be following up with the questions we did not have the time to answer. We will also follow up with the PowerPoint and the video, the recording of this webinar. So for those of you who missed pieces or who would like to extrapolate some further information, we'll make that available to you. We'd like again to thank the Citizenship and Immigration Canada for making this webinar possible. Now we welcome you to stay in touch. We put an email address on the screen right now, info@caf-fca.org. If you have any further questions, please feel free to email us. We also invite you to let us know if you're interested in being on our monthly newsletter, Apprenticeship News, so you won't miss on any great events that might be in your area. We do organize some regional events as well as some online events. Our next webinar will actually take place on next Friday, April 25th at 1 p.m. It is called Women's Work, Challenges and Opportunities in the Skilled Trades. We're going to be featuring 4 women tradespeople who are going to be talking about their experiences in the trade. We'll be sending out the link to register to that in a follow-up email as well, and we hope you'll be joining us there. It should be another great one filled with some interesting information. Also, we'd like to hear from you what topics you'd like to hear in the future. These webinars are catered to be of use to the apprenticeship community across Canada, so we really want to know what you'd like to hear and what would help you more. So feel free to email us or call us. You have all the information on your screen. Also, we'd love to welcome you to the Skilled Trades Summit, Canada's National Apprenticeship Conference. If you've not heard from this, we're welcoming speakers from across Canada and internationally to this event. This is a biannual event, so every 2 years, and we travel across the country. So this year we'll be in Ottawa, Ontario from June 1st to the 3rd. Registration is currently open, and we certainly hope that we'll see you there, where we're going to have great discussions such as the one Maureen gave us today, as well as discussions on a bunch of other topics of interest to the apprenticeship community. So you can get more information on that on the web address up on your screens right now. So if you have any more questions, please don't hesitate to contact us, and we will be in touch. Thank you all for joining us, and have a great afternoon.